Mark gripped the steering wheel tightly as the car navigated the winding, wooded road, its headlights flickering against the towering trees on either side. The gnarled branches formed a twisted canopy overhead, creating a tunnel of shadows. Sarah sat silently beside him, her fingers drumming anxiously against her lap. The air in the car was thick, heavy with tension, and the silence was only broken by the occasional hum of the tires against the uneven road. "Almost there," Mark said, his voice steady but forced. Sarah gave a faint nod, but her unease was clear. She glanced out the window again, watching the dark silhouettes of the trees blur past them. It felt as if the forest was closing in around them, the shadows deepening with every mile. They had booked the remote Airbnb for a quiet weekend getaway, a chance to escape the noise of the city and the constant hum of life always demanding something from them. But now, as the cabin came into view, Sarah couldn't shake the unease that had been growing since they left the main road. The cabin stood alone in a clearing, far from any other signs of civilization. Its dark wooden exterior was weathered, with the paint peeling in patches, revealing the gray wood beneath. Dim lights flickered inside the windows. Though it wasn't comforting, it only added to the sense of something being wrong. Mark parked the car cautiously in front of the cabin, the tires crunching softly against the gravel. He turned off the engine, and the silence that followed was deafening. "We're here," Mark said softly, but the words did little to ease the tension between them. Sarah grabbed her bag and stepped out into the night, her boots making hollow thuds on the wooden porch. The air felt colder here, a damp chill that seemed to seep into her very bones. She glanced back at the car, its headlights dim in the thick darkness, and shivered. "Why do I feel like we're the only people who've been here in years?" Sarah murmured, half to herself. Mark followed her, locking the car behind them. "It's isolated, that's all. The whole point of coming out here was to get away from everything." "But this feels different," Sarah said, her voice low and hesitant. They entered the cabin through the creaky front door. The interior was dimly lit by a single overhead bulb, the light flickering weakly before stabilizing. The room was small, with a worn-out couch and a fireplace that hadn't been used in ages. Dust motes swirled lazily in the faint light, adding to the sense of abandonment. Mark tried the other switches, but nothing worked. The electricity had clearly been shut off. Outside, the forest pressed in on all sides, and the stillness was almost suffocating. "It's strange," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "I know," Mark admitted, glancing around. "But hey, it's just a power issue. Nothing to worry about." Yet, as they settled in, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Small, unsettling noises began to surface, footsteps from the floor above, distant whispers that barely reached her ears. Every sound seemed amplified in the quiet pop, growing more oppressive with each passing second. "I think I heard something," Sarah said quietly, her eyes searching the shadows. Mark furrowed his brow, but there was a flicker of doubt in his expression. "It's just the wind," he said, though his voice held a trace of uncertainty. But it wasn't the wind. Sarah heard it again, faint, almost imperceptible, a soft creak as if someone had shifted their weight on the old floorboards. "See? Nothing," Mark said again, this time louder, forcing a laugh to cover his discomfort. Sarah shook her head slowly, her pulse quickening. "No, Mark. Someone's here." He stiffened, his grip tightening on the edge of the chair he was sitting on. "That's impossible. No one else knew about this place." The doubt in his voice wasn't comforting. And then Sarah found something, a photograph tucked into the corner of an old shelf. She picked it up carefully, her breath catching as she stared at the faded image. It was a picture of a couple, smiling for the camera. The man looked familiar, but the woman was the one who made her heart race. The woman had the same pale skin, the same deep-set eyes that felt as though they pierced into her very soul. "It's me," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking as she held the photograph out to Mark. "It's me." Mark leaned in, his brow furrowing. "That can't be." "Look," Sarah urged, her voice rising in desperation. "That's me. That's me in the picture." Mark took the photograph, studying it carefully, but his expression was a mix of confusion and fear. "There has to be some mistake," he said finally, though his voice betrayed his growing unease. "Maybe it's the previous owner, or—" Mark started, but his words trailed off as he looked back at Sarah. Her face was pale, her lips trembling. She held the photograph tightly, as if letting go would shatter her sanity. "Something isn't right here, Mark. This place, it's been watching us." Mark shook his head, forcing a weak smile, but the cracks in his composure were visible. "We need to get some sleep," he said, though his tone was far from certain. The room fell back into darkness, the shadows shifting unnaturally. As they lay in silence, Mark couldn't help but think that Sarah was right. Something was watching, and it wasn't going to let them leave easily. The first night in the Airbnb was anything but peaceful. Mark lay on the thin mattress, staring up at the ceiling, his mind racing with unsettling thoughts. The cabin was silent, except for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards beneath them. Every sound seemed amplified in the stillness, and the weight of the darkness pressed against them like a heavy blanket. Sarah was asleep beside him, her breathing slow and steady. Mark shifted uncomfortably, unable to shake the feeling of something being off. His eyes flicked to the window across the room, the heavy curtains drawn tightly. He was about to close his eyes again when he heard it, a soft, echoing sound. Footsteps. At first, it was barely more than a whisper, like the shuffle of leaves in the wind. But the sound grew louder, more distinct. They were faint, deliberate, almost as if someone was walking just outside their door. Mark sat up in bed, his heart pounding against his ribs. "Sarah," he whispered urgently, shaking her gently. She stirred, but didn't wake. Mark didn't have time to wake her. The footsteps were getting closer. A chill ran down his spine as the noise became louder, heavier, like the slow, measured steps of someone moving purposefully through the darkness. "Mark," Sarah mumbled sleepily, her voice slurred. The footsteps stopped just beyond the door. Mark's breath hitched in his throat. The silence that followed was suffocating, oppressive. It felt like the world had frozen in place, leaving only the sound of his ragged breathing. Slowly, the door creaked open. A shadow slipped inside. Mark's mouth was dry, his body frozen in place. He couldn't move. His mind screamed at him to run, to make a sound, but his muscles refused to obey. The figure stood motionless in the doorway, its shape indistinct, more like a dark, shifting mass rather than a clear form. Sarah shifted beside him, mumbling again. The figure didn't move, just stood there, its presence filling the room with a chilling weight. Mark's chest rose and fell rapidly as he tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The room seemed to shrink around them, the darkness pressing in tighter with every passing second. Then, without a sound, the figure disappeared. One moment it was there, watching them, its presence suffocating, and the next it was gone. Mark's breath came in ragged gasps. He tried to wake Sarah again, harder this time. Her eyes fluttered open, her gaze unfocused. "What is it?" she murmured, her voice hoarse. "We need to leave," Mark said quickly, though his voice cracked with fear. "Mark, what happened?" Sarah asked, her face pale as she sat up. "I don't know," Mark whispered, his voice trembling. "There was something standing in the doorway. It was just there, watching us." Sarah clutched the blanket tighter around her, her eyes darting around the room. "You're serious? Like a person?" "No." Mark shook his head, struggling to form coherent thoughts. "It wasn't human. It wasn't anything. It was just there." They sat in silence for what felt like hours, listening for any sound beyond the pounding of their hearts. Outside, the forest seemed to hum quietly, a subtle, eerie noise that sent chills down their spines. The absence of light from the windows only deepened the sense of dread. Mark finally broke the silence. "We have to get out of here," he said again, more firm this time. "There's something wrong with this place." "But where would we go?" Sarah asked, her voice hollow with fear. "It's miles to the nearest town." Mark rubbed his temples, trying to think through the panic that clouded his mind. "We'll figure it out," he said after a moment. "But we can't stay here. Not tonight." As they sat huddled together, fear tightening its grip around them, the sense of unease only grew stronger. The cabin felt alive, watching, waiting, and Mark knew they had barely scratched the surface of whatever dark secrets the Airbnb held. The sun filtered weakly through the towering trees, casting long, shifting shadows over the forest floor. The previous night's events left Mark and Sarah unsettled, their nerves frayed. They decided to step outside, hoping the fresh air would clear their heads. As they wandered deeper into the woods, the cabin became a distant memory behind them. Suddenly, they came across something unexpected, a rusted gate, nearly hidden among the trees. Its iron bars were twisted and covered in rust, as if decades of neglect had claimed it. The gate leaned slightly, creaking on its hinges as a cold breeze swept through the forest. "What is this?" Sarah asked softly, her voice tinged with curiosity and unease. She reached out, brushing away some of the vines that had grown around the gate. Mark examined it, his brow furrowed. "Looks like an old trail," he said, though doubt crept into his voice. "But where does it lead?" Sarah shivered, feeling the weight of the still, empty forest pressing in on them. "It's like no one's been here in years," she said, her eyes scanning the thick undergrowth beyond the gate. Their phones buzzed uselessly in their hands, signaling no signal. The realization struck them both at the same time. They were truly alone, with no way to call for help. "Let's turn back," Sarah suggested, her voice shaky. Mark glanced at her and nodded. "Yeah, maybe you're right. We shouldn't push too far into." But before he could finish, a low, unsettling noise echoed through the trees, a sound like something scraping against bark, slow and deliberate. Both of them froze, their breaths catching in their throats. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, clutching her arms tightly around herself. Mark didn't answer right away. His eyes searched the trees, the shadows twisting unnaturally. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. They turned back to the gate, but something stopped them. A faint, almost imperceptible path, barely visible beneath the fallen leaves and twigs. It was as if the forest itself was swallowing the trail. "We can't turn back now," Mark said, his voice low but firm. "We need to see where this goes." Sarah hesitated, her fear evident, but followed him as he stepped through the gate. Every step they took along the narrow trail felt heavier, like the air was pressing down on them. The trees loomed overhead, their branches intertwining to form a natural canopy that blocked out the sun entirely. It was as if the light itself had abandoned them. The sounds of the forest seemed to intensify, whispers that were almost audible, soft rustling as unseen creatures moved just out of sight. Sarah glanced nervously at Mark, her pulse quickening. "Something's following us," she said, her voice trembling. Mark's jaw tightened as he kept moving forward, though the fear was evident in his eyes. "Don't say that," he warned, but his tone lacked conviction. They pressed on, the trail growing narrower with each step. The sounds became louder, more distinct. Shadows shifted at the edges of their vision, moving with a life of their own. "It feels like we're not alone," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. Mark nodded solemnly. "We're not." Suddenly, the path widened, revealing something chilling. More rusted gates. Dozens of them lined the trail, each one almost identical to the first, their bars crooked and vines encroaching upon them. There were no paths beyond these gates, no way to continue, only a dead end. "We're trapped," Sarah gasped. Mark scanned the rows of gates, his heart racing. "No," he said quickly, "there has to be another way out." But the forest seemed to mock them, closing in even tighter. The shadows deepened, and the air grew colder. They could feel it. Something was watching them, something with no face, no form, just an overwhelming sense of malice. "We're retracing someone else's steps," Mark said, his voice hollow with realization. "Whoever was here before, they never left." The fear gripped them harder than ever before. Sarah clutched Mark's hand tightly, her fingers icy. The rusted gates felt like they were closing in on them, an unnatural prison deep in the heart of the woods. The only sounds were their ragged breaths and the distant echoes of something that didn't want them to leave. Inside the abandoned cabin, the air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. Sunlight barely seeped through broken windows, casting jagged patterns across the wooden floor. Mark and Sarah moved cautiously, their steps echoing unnaturally in the stillness. Every creak of the floorboard seemed amplified, the sounds of their footsteps reverberating through the empty space like whispers. As they explored, Sarah's gaze was drawn to the small objects scattered around the room. A weathered letter lay atop a rickety wooden table, its ink faded, but still legible. She picked it up carefully, her fingers trembling. "It's from someone," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Mark peered over her shoulder, his brow furrowed. The letter was dated years ago, filled with words that seemed oddly disconnected from the current surroundings. It spoke of the beauty of the forest, the peace of the cabin, and an invitation to return again. Yet there was something haunting about the message, an emptiness beneath the surface. Sarah set the letter down gently, her thoughts racing. "Who wrote this?" she murmured, her voice quivering. Why leave it here? Her curiosity was replaced with unease as they moved deeper into the cabin. Every room was untouched, frozen in time. A single photograph leaned against a dusty shelf, a faded family picture, smiling faces stained with shadows. The image felt alive, its presence thickening the oppressive atmosphere. Mark shivered, his eyes scanning the space. "There's no one here," he said, though the words didn't comfort either of them. "Yet it feels like something is watching us." They exchanged uneasy glances, but neither spoke. The shadows flickered in the dim light, moving subtly across the walls. Whispers began to drift through the air, a soft, haunting murmur that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Sarah clutched Mark's arm tightly, her breath hitching. "Stop," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I hear it too." Mark nodded slowly, his pulse quickening with each passing second. "It's not just in our heads," he admitted, his voice barely audible. The whispers grew louder, echoing off the wooden walls, filling the space until it felt as though they were being suffocated. Shadows slithered across the floor, weaving around their feet, always just a little too close. Suddenly, Sarah froze. Her eyes widened, and she pointed toward the corner of the room. "That's where it was," she said, her voice trembling. "The shadow. It was standing there." Mark followed her gaze, his breath hitching. Nothing was there now, just the emptiness of the cabin. But the memory of the figure haunted them both. The image burned into their minds. They pushed forward, their breaths shallow, but the sense of being trapped only deepened with every room they entered. Every object felt unnatural. Chairs pulled out as if someone had been sitting there just moments ago, books scattered as if mid-read. Yet there was no sign of life. On a creaking bookshelf, Sarah found a small, leather-bound diary. She picked it up carefully, flipping through the pages as if afraid of what she might find. Mark leaned in close, his breath fogging the pages as he read over her shoulder. "It's a journal," he murmured, "from someone who stayed here." The words were fragmented, the handwriting frantic. They described strange occurrences, the whispers, the shadows, and something darker. A sense of foreboding that had been building with each passing day. Then, near the end, a chilling entry stood out. "We're not alone. They're watching. They won't let us leave." Both of them fell silent, the weight of the words sinking deep into their minds. Sarah's hand trembled as she shut the diary, her face pale. "This can't be real," she whispered, though her voice held no conviction. Mark's expression was grim. "It is," he said quietly. "And whatever this is, it's not going away." The cabin seemed alive around them, a prison of twisted wood and dark memories. Shadows danced in the corners of their vision, moving closer with every passing moment. The whispers turned into soft, chilling laughter, an oppressive, endless noise that pressed down on them like a suffocating fog. They were trapped, not just in the abandoned cabin, but in the horror of its history. Every breath felt heavier, every step more unbearable. The world beyond the cabin blurred into insignificance, leaving only the darkness that consumed them. Nightfall descended upon the abandoned cabin, plunging the space into a suffocating darkness. Outside, the forest whispered endlessly, its sounds blending into a symphony of terror. Mark and Sarah huddled together in silence, their breaths shallow and their hearts pounding. Suddenly, the walls seemed to come alive, shifting subtly, as if they were holding secrets that refused to be ignored. Faint whispers floated through the room, soft and indistinct at first, but gradually becoming clearer. They weren't just random echoes, they were deliberate, directed. "Help us." The voice was soft, almost tender, but filled with an unsettling sorrow. Sarah's grip tightened on Mark's arm as she shivered. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Mark nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the shadows that seemed to pulse with every sound. "Yeah," he said, his voice hushed. "It's here. It's all around us." The whispers intensified, turning into fragmented sentences that seemed to float just beyond reach. "Never leave. Darkness watches. You're next." Their breaths hitched, each sound slicing through the air like a cold blade. Every noise, the creaking of the floorboards, the rustling of distant leaves, became purposeful, as if it had a sinister intent behind it. "I can't do this," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "We have to get out of here." Mark shook his head, his mind racing for a way out that seemed impossible. "There's no way out," he murmured, his voice a ghostly echo. "They won't let us leave." The room felt tighter, suffocating. Shadows flickered along the walls, stretching and morphing into grotesque shapes. They twisted into figures, ghostly apparitions that loomed in the corners of the cabin. Sarah let out a scream as one shadowy figure reached for her, its fingers elongated and clawed. Mark pulled her close, shielding her as best he could, though fear gripped his own chest tightly. "Stay away!" Sarah cried, her voice breaking with desperation. But the figure didn't disappear. Instead, it grew closer, whispering into the void. "You're already trapped," the voice hissed, colder than ice. "The same fate awaits you as the others." Mark's breath caught in his throat, his mind reeling with the horror of those words. "No," he said weakly. "That can't be." But deep down, he knew it was true. The apparitions, those twisted shapes, were mirrors of the vanished guests, their lifeless eyes staring into the abyss that had swallowed them whole. "We have to fight," Mark said, though the determination in his voice felt hollow. His hands trembled as he gripped a wooden chair, using it as a weapon against the encroaching terror. Sarah sobbed softly, her body trembling uncontrollably. "There's nothing we can do," she whispered. "We're trapped in their nightmare." The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Join us," they chanted. "There's no escape. No escape." Mark's grip on the chair tightened as another figure emerged from the darkness, a tall, gaunt figure with hollow eyes that burned into their souls. "You'll be one of us soon," it said in a voice that resonated through their very bones. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she collapsed to the floor, her body convulsing with terror. Mark fell beside her, unable to fight the overwhelming hopelessness that engulfed them. "We're going to die here," Sarah sobbed, her voice breaking as the shadows closed in tighter, surrounding them like a living nightmare. "No," Mark whispered fiercely, though his voice was barely audible. "We won't. We won't." But deep down, he knew. Every word, every chilling whisper, their fate had already been sealed. The silence in the forest was suffocating. The trees stood like sentinels, their branches clawing at the dark sky. Mark twisted the key in the ignition, but the car let out a pathetic sputter before dying altogether. They were stranded, alone, miles from the nearest sign of life. The weight of the forest pressed in on them, each shadow a lurking threat in the darkness. Mark climbed out of the car, inspecting the hood, but it was clear they wouldn't be going anywhere anytime soon. Sarah sat quietly in the passenger seat, her face pale and her hands trembling. Her mind was racing, unable to comprehend the nightmare they were now trapped in. Suddenly, a cold breeze brushed past them, and the forest seemed to sigh around them. The familiar sense of isolation crept in, and the oppressive quiet was broken only by distant rustling, a sound much too deliberate for the wilderness. "We have to move," Mark said, his voice steady though his heart was hammering in his chest. "We can't stay here." Sarah nodded, unable to speak. Her throat was dry, and every breath felt heavy. They took a few hesitant steps away from the car, their surroundings dark and oppressive. The woods seemed alive, shadows shifting with an unsettling life of their own. "This is it," Sarah whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "This is where it all started." Mark gave her a pained look. He wanted to argue, to offer hope, but deep down, he knew she was right. The forest wasn't just a random place. They had stumbled into something far more sinister. The whispers began again, a soft, rustling sound, barely audible at first, but growing louder with each passing second. They felt like 1,000 voices, murmuring in unison, circling around them with malicious intent. Mark pulled Sarah closer, the chill in the air cutting through their clothes like knives. Every step forward felt heavier, every movement more labored. The forest pressed in tighter, walls of darkness closing them in. Then, just as the fear reached its peak, a vision came to Sarah. She saw herself, standing in the very spot where they now stood, but alone. Her body lifeless, eyes wide and frozen in a silent scream. "No," she gasped, staggering back. "No, no, no." Mark spun around, his face twisted in confusion and terror. "What? What is it?" Sarah paused, struggling to find the words. "I saw myself. There's no escape. Her voice broke, and she fell to her knees, her hands clawing at the ground. Mark knelt beside her, gripping her shoulders tightly. "We won't let that happen," he said, though the conviction in his voice was thin. "We're not going to let them win." But the forest had other plans. Shadows seemed to swell around them, dark shapes reaching out with clawed hands, whispering their fate into the oppressive silence. Every breath felt heavier, as though the air itself was laced with a toxic weight. They were part of the cycle now. This wasn't an isolated incident. This wasn't a temporary horror. The forest, the cabin, and everything between them had been woven into a deadly tapestry, one that swallowed souls whole and spit them out into oblivion. Mark's grip on Sarah tightened, but there was no strength left to fight. The vision clung to her mind, a never-ending loop of terror. Her own body swallowed by darkness, lost forever. In the distance, the car remained abandoned, but it no longer mattered. The forest wasn't a place they could escape. The cycle had begun anew, and once you stepped into its grasp, there was no way out.